Hello, and welcome to the first lecture for Topic 7, Chapter 13, The Presidency. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the Constitution, Article 2, and how it establishes the presidency. Remember, there is no precedent in the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution creates this new position. The thinking was that coming out of the failures of the Articles of Confederation, that there was a sense that it was very important if we needed a federal government that was stronger and more unified, that we would need to have a single individual embodying the power of the executive branch. And thus, Article 2 establishes that presidency. Now, there are different sections within Article 2. We're going to take a look at what each of the sections do. In Section 1, since we didn't have a presidency and we're creating this new constitution, it establishes the office of the presidency along with the office of the vice presidency. It tells us about the term of office, the qualifications needed, and the oath of office. All of that is included in Section 1. Now, keep in mind today, presidents can only serve 2 four-year terms. That was not the case when the Constitution was initially ratified. It did say that the term of office was 4 years, but there was nothing that said that you could serve. It told us nothing about how many terms you could serve. The tradition is that presidents would serve no more than 2 four-year terms. That was a precedent that was set by our first president, George Washington. And up until President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that tradition had been abided by. But President Roosevelt ran for re-election for a third term in 1940, and he won that election. And that really shook up people in the United States. They were upset that he ran for a third term and then subsequently ran for a fourth term and won both. And so that led to the movement to amend our Constitution to prohibit people from holding more than 2 four-year terms. And so in 1951, the 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution, limiting the number of terms that a president can serve to 2. Article 1 also tells us how the president is going to be selected. This was a debate at the Constitutional Convention about who should select the president. There was some debate that Congress should select the president, sort of like a parliamentary system, that whatever party wins the most or whatever the majority of the Congress desires would become president of the United States. But that was rejected because they wanted the presidency to be autonomous from the other branches of government. And so they threw out that idea. They toyed with the idea that the presidency should be directly elected by the people, but they discarded that idea as well. At that time, education was not as widespread in the United States as it is today. Plus, it would be difficult for a president to get to know or campaign for office, given sort of the rural nature of the United States. And so a compromise was struck. And that compromise is known as the Electoral College. You'll be learning about the Electoral College this week in our discussion that we're having that corresponds with the presidency. Section 2 and Section 3 of Article 2 deal with the powers and duties of the office of the presidency. And in this lecture and the subsequent lecture, we're going to dig into what are known as the express powers of the presidency that are found in the Constitution in more detail. But if you're looking at your Constitution, you will find these in Article 2 and Section 2 and 3. Section 4 of the Constitution tells us about the process for removal of the president. And in the Constitution today, there are 2 places where we find the process for removal. In Article 2, Section 4, it talks about the process of impeachment and removal. We also find the details of that in Article 1 as well. And we'll talk about impeachment and removal in one moment. After the assassination of President Kennedy, the 25th Amendment was added to the Constitution. And that the 25th Amendment deals with the procedures for replacing the president or vice president in the event of death, removal, resignation, or some sort of incapacitation. And so it kind of builds upon the concerns that were outlined in Article 2, Section 4. But when it comes specifically to impeachment, the notion is that, and the purpose of having a process for removing the president, that James Madison, was concerned that if we select a president via the Electoral College, and then when the president is in office and they do something that is a complete breach of the trust of the people of the United States, there should be some process for dealing with that breach of trust. And that's what the impeachment process is. That the Constitution tells us what the grounds for impeachment are: treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors that aren't clearly defined. And it also tells us that both the House and the Senate will be involved in the removal process of the president. The impeachment takes place in the House. And I like to tell my students that the impeachment process is sort of like a grand jury inquiry. In a grand jury inquiry, what a grand jury does is that they look at charges. You see an individual and you say, you know what? The prosecutor charges this individual with a crime. And then a grand jury looks at the evidence and it determines whether or not the prosecutor's claim that this individual engaged in a crime, they determine whether or not that claim is sound or justified. And that's kind of what the impeachment process in the House is. In the House, they will pass articles of impeachment, and that basically they say that they make an argument that these are the crimes that we think the president engaged in: treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And then based on that, they'll say, you know what, there does seem to be enough evidence here to say that the president has been engaged in a crime. And so the impeachment is sort of like saying it's sustaining the charges against the president. Then it moves to the Senate, and it's the Senate where there's actually a trial that takes place to determine whether or not the president is guilty as charged, right? The impeachment says, yes, there's support for these charges. And then the trial is basically a trial to determine whether or not the president is guilty of the articles of impeachment, and that he would then be removed from office. Now, only 3 presidents in the United States have ever been impeached, and none have been removed from office. The first person to be impeached was Andrew Johnson, the vice president of Abraham Lincoln. So when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became the president of the United States. The second president to be impeached was not Nixon, but Bill Clinton. They started with articles of impeachment against Nixon, but as soon as he saw the writing on the wall that he was in fact going to be impeached and removed from office, he resigned. So the second individual is Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton was impeached for lying about his affair with Monica Lewinsky in a courtroom. He perjured himself. And then, most recently, Donald Trump was impeached for his involvement in the Ukrainian scandal. None of those have been presidents were removed from office, and as I said, that no president has ever been removed as a process of the trial in the Senate. Let's move on now to talk about sources of presidential power that your textbook talks about. One source is the constitutional powers. The other is what's known as institutional powers. And your textbook also talks about the contemporary expansion of presidential power. When the framers created the Constitution, they did not view the presidency as the most powerful branch. They thought Congress would be the most powerful branch. That's changed substantially during the course of the 20th century, where we see an increased power that is wielded by the presidency. And so you'll be reading about that in your textbook. But let's take a look at the constitutional powers of the presidency, in particular, the different categories of constitutional power. When it comes to constitutional powers of the president, there are different categories that you should keep in mind and that your textbook talks about. One is known as the express powers of the presidency. And these are the powers that are listed in the Constitution and exclusive to the president. An example of that would be the veto power. Now, think about this in relationship to the enumerated powers of Congress. Remember, in our last topic, Article 1, Section 8 provided specific powers that are unique to and exclusive to the Congress. The express powers of the president are like that, that they are listed in the Constitution and only the president can engage in those powers. Another category of constitutional power is what is known as implied power. And implied powers are powers that are not explicitly written in the Constitution. However, they're powers that are deemed necessary to allow the presidents to exercise the powers that are written down, the expressed powers. And, implied powers also come from Article 2, Section 1, and it's sometimes referred to as the vesting clause. And in the vesting clause, it says that the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. So the thinking is that executive power goes beyond just what are the expressed powers in the Constitution. Likewise, just as the necessary and proper clause gives Congress the power to sort of engage in actions that are not explicitly listed in the Constitution, the necessary and proper clause gives that same power to the President of the United States. An example of implied powers is the power to remove officers, and they talk about this in your textbook. And so in the Constitution, it expressly says that the president has the express power to appoint federal officers to the executive branch, such as secretaries of the particular executive departments. But it doesn't say anything about whether or not the president has the power to remove those officers. But as an executive, and also it's sort of an implied, if you appoint, then you must also have the power to remove, since they are closely related. That's an example of the way that the implied power sort of stretches the expressed powers of the presidency. Another category of constitutional powers of the president is delegated powers. And delegated powers are the power that Congress gives to the president to implement law. The president is the chief executive officer, and that they are empowered to enact all federal law. But there are some times when a bill that's been passed by Congress and signed into law by the president of the United States, sometimes the law itself will lack detail. And so the thinking is that Congress passes this law and they hand it over to the executive branch, and then the executive branch is delegating to the Congress is delegating to the executive branch that saying, okay, we delegate to you the power to actually implement this law. The Affordable Care Act is a good example of that, and that's the example that they use in the textbook. The Affordable Care Act, the law itself lacked some details about how we were going to expand health insurance in the United States. And so when it came to that, the Congress basically delegates to the executive branch and says, you guys figure out the details. And so the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, was charged with coming up with how this law was actually going to be implemented. And so it's a good example of the way that Congress gives the executive branch power in order to implement law. Inherent powers are, this is a fourth source of power that presidents have claimed. Now, these are powers that are not specified in the Constitution, but rather these powers stem from the rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency, sort of taken as a whole. And they are most often asserted by presidents in times of war or in times of national emergency. And Abraham Lincoln really found these inherent powers in his oath of office, and they referenced that in the textbook. Abraham Lincoln, in the oath of office, it says that the president solemnly swears to execute the office of the president of the United States to the best of their ability, and to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. So Abraham Lincoln was, thinking was that, the president has this obligation because of their oath of office to do whatever it takes to basically defend the United States and the Constitution. And so it's a sort of broad power that's unwritten, and in fact, maybe constitutional, right? Although oftentimes during times of national emergency, that question doesn't come to the Supreme Court. And in your textbook, you will learn about some of the actions that Abraham Lincoln took under the guise of inherent powers in order to defend the Constitution of the United States as well as the United States as a whole. And so he suspends the writ of habeas corpus. He, declares martial law, withdrew funds from the Treasury. That's a pretty long list. And he viewed those all as constitutional because they are these inherent powers that are encapsulated into the rights, duties, and obligations of the presidency. Okay, on the next slide, we'll talk specifically about the different express powers that are granted to the President of the United States.